How's that? We are live in
Sweet.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Art of Move podcast with myself, Anthony Manuel, my good friend, Dr. William Raybar. We are still out here in the Canadian Rockies trying to find the grand unified theory of human movement, biomechanics, functional training, and what it is to live and be in a human body. Today, we are joined by my good friend, Nathan, the founder of the system MovMed, which I had the recent privilege of going through the certification process of. I have a lot more of an experiential understanding of the system, and I've gained massive benefits from doing it, and is, like, I would say, actually the cornerstone of my practice at this point in terms of physical strength training and training in general, postural training, and it's just the cornerstone of my practice at this current juncture of time. And so the last time we interviewed Nate, we it was quite a while ago. I would say like maybe even close to last summer, and the system has quite like you said right before we started this conversation, it has evolved quite a bit since we last talked. And so from your perspective, from the last conversation that we had, what I would love to jump right into is, how do you feel your system and your approach to training has evolved or become refined since the last conversation that we had?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me on. Appreciate you guys welcoming me back. Um, and I'm happy to hear that movement is such a big part of your practice right now. It's exciting to see your progress pics and updates. Um, how would I say it's been developed? I mean, at present time, we're about to release a book that's in the final stages of editing that should go into, I mean, you have access to it, but it should go into um, a full flurry of like the introductory questions to movement and a lot of the questions many people have about structure, posture, movement in general. And it's taken a good bit of work. I'm having a good bit of help in it, and I'm grateful for that, because if I didn't, it'd take a couple more years. Um, Aside that, we have some certs that are coming active. So we have an active in-person cert that's going to be July 21st to July 23rd, held in Santa Rosa, where you've participated in the online version. We've so far had 2 online certified groups. I'm halfway through the second certification. Uh, and we're building out a community. We're building out a resource pool where you can, aside myself, aside Ben, aside Dave, you can find other coaches. Anthony is technically one of those qualified coaches now. Yeah, there's a lot more options for who you can interact with to get the same information, or find a different rapport, whether it be me, Ben, Dave, Anthony, or the 26 others.
Sweet. In terms of the groundwork for things like posture and movement and some of the fundamentals, what are some of the things that you're covering in the book? Because I have access to it, but for those who are going to grab the book, what can they expect to read?
So a lot of the neurodevelopment talk that goes into other systems is largely to do with baby behavior. And I think one of the notions that I really took to, that I'd learned from an animal book, Temple Grandin, Animals in Translation. She's autistic, but she's also one of the most world-renowned providers or educators on animal well-being, particularly domesticated animals like livestock animals. So she's done a number of things about providing animals that were refusing to go into a new, maybe it was a slaughterhouse, maybe it was their own stable or whatever it was, but if it was like metal on the floor that was supplied from the animals that no one would have paid attention to, because she was so heavily sensory, that was something that she was able to provide herself some means of observation. And if we contextualize stress as being just sensory dysregulation, or there being a profile of not knowing how to process what you are, what inputs are being uh, at least considered, at the very least considered, not necessarily processed, you'll start to understand that most behaviors that differentiate us in social environments or from animals we want to connect with, or babies we want to connect with, is usually that stimulation. And when I looked at uh, how she had described animals perceiving things, I looked into dogs, for example. They're born and they're blind. I think it's nose, ears, and then sight. Uh, and for us, it's smell, touch, taste, and then hearing, and sight is our last presiding sense. even though it is our governing sense when we're in a conscious state or as we're an active human, there are degrees of vision that have to be developed, or we have to be able to like train ourselves with the light exposure for us to be able to consider the muscles being acute and capable of taking in an input stimulus. So when I looked into that and I knew how valuable vision was for movement theory, I started to understand that there was a underlying sensory side or a profile to vision that wasn't quite considered, and I wanted to understand how it was that we were able to create our senses, but as a conglomerate, not as a individuation of senses. So like when I breathe, the input of pressure fixes my eyes into a level state that's registered at my vestibular system. And all the bones that are able to perceive the intake of pressure, if they're not being oxygenated through that process, or if they're compressed, then there are going to be degrees of like misallocated cranial nerve inputs hemispherically. And as soon as we start to become dual hemispheric in our head, we start to become dual hemispheric in the translation of like nose to thorax. So then we start to correlate. Maybe this is my sympathetic side just because uh, this eye, which is intending to be dominant, is just creating tension earlier than this side because the pressure that comes through here is quicker and it's not being adequately adjusted or processed. So, like, I'm rushing too fast on that side, which is, I think, in the case of most of us, what we're more often than not doing. The compression of this side of our head, this lung, and so on and so forth. We think it's rotational, but more often than not, it's the cranial fascia compressing, and then the coincidental like domino effect between fascial points are what you call it, are neural crests in embryo in development in embryo. The things that create our fascial points, like where fascia originates from, as we source tissue, as we source um, like the organs, it all comes from like stem points, and those are neural crest, the cranial neural crest, the neural crest of our heart, neural crest of our gut, neural crest of our sacrum. So when we talk cranial sacral, we're talking essentially the relationship between how these landmarks developed in embryo. And I wanted to develop a system of sensation that respected how embryology wasn't individuation of senses, but collection of senses building through those uh, source points.
So,
Yeah.
can we dive into the embryology itself? Like basically, I've looked into embryology in school.
Yeah.
So, obviously not through this lens, right?
Yep.
The Basically you have a plate, folds in, different structures are made. We're talking the tube of the gastrointestinal system, the neural tubes. So, are you kind of saying that the cells that create together are also wired together in adulthood? Is that where you're going with it? Or could you dive into
It's
the
all. Yeah.
embryology and get as nerdy as you want to here?
Yeah. Yeah. So we all start out. One of the main chapters of the book is the asshole we all grew from, which is to suggest we all started in embryological stage as a deuterosome, and in humans or mammals, the deuterosome starts as an anus first, where in other species that are not mammals, it can start as the mouth first. Forget the name for how they qualify those two. Um, But as we source, we start from butt. Neural tube forms within the construct of what forms from that, like you say, like root point, the tree or the stem that grows from that is neural tube. And halfway up neural tube, deuterosome is called deuterosome because it translates to two mouths, and it's not referring to the butt and the mouth. It's talking about the diaphragm and the mouth. So in contextualizing what the mind-gut connection is, we first form the gut, then we form the brain. And so, in contextualizing what our most intrinsic viscera is, we're contextualizing that our brain doesn't process this as being us. It processes the heart down, or essentially everything that's lining the spine. So the limbs are extra; they just allow for us to be a little more evolved. But what we're really contextualizing is the safety, security, and the pressurization or the stack of organs, heart, and then brain, and then that's where skull forms around, and our skeleton forms around what first forms, which is the neural tube, and then the brain, and then the spine, and so on and so forth. But as we're forming through the neural tube, the neural crests themselves, the things that form those individual points, are it's like in the same way like a universe first implodes, like how you had said that it flattens on itself or it folds in on itself like a torus. The affect of being able to create that like gravitational extra, or the buoyancy, the brace, is not an effort of flexing outward. It's an effort of collapsing inward and then resupplying our most visceral organs and visceral structures with blood. And because all the fascial lines are fabricated in these points, these neural crest points, you can kind of like allocate like this. It's like it blooms outward and like unfurls in the same way that it kind of like folded inward to create itself. There's this almost like reperpetuation of cellular development. I think that in the same way that like mitochondrial cellular micro is working from that like redistribute, like the folding unfolding effect. If we stay in a folded state and our breath isn't folding unfolding us, then we're not giving ourselves the same elastic measure that's designing us. And I don't want to say that we are consciously the same factors, like we're not intertwined where I know all these things are connected, but I do know that if I'm not oxygenating well enough in one nerve point or one neural crest point, then the mirror effect or the reflex past my diaphragm is not happening adequately. And that's to say, like, a lot of the process that most people misconstrue, inhalation, although it is interbulating, although it makes you excited, it's largely only exciting because it's putting fuel to the fire. It's giving you fuel to source new action from. And as we're always combating pressure or always combating atmosphere, while we exhale, we're losing internal atmosphere. So each time we inhale, we're essentially increasing our potential to fight. So if we exist in this extrinsic nature where we're trying to oxygenate our periphery first, and we're not first sourcing that midline stability, then majority of the action that goes straight to our brain is, hey, we're not stable. We need to create more strict action in our periphery, which is already overstimulated, and make sure that our midline can garner more stability. So eventually what we're doing is we're putting stricture on the point that should be more subtly attentive, because there's so much active tone in our hands, feet, our face, our neural crest points.
Like, on a fundamental definition, could you tell the audience what a neural crest is?
I could read you the definition, but if I'm going to say it off the top of my head, I'm for sure going to bastardize it. I would say, like, it's a seedling of fascia. Like, we don't necessarily source like a full body. Like, it's not like we're a tiny little body that starts to grow bigger, like one of those toys you put in water. We're a cell that becomes more dynamic, interacting with itself and learning how to recycle its own process. So it's becoming more capable of being like environmentally supported instead of having to combat the environment. And because you're in the womb, you're protected. There's a nature of satiating flexion, not like flexion that has to keep prescribing more action, but like you're in a safe space, you can keep growing in that space. It's ideal, but it's not interactive with what our visual system would start interacting with. It's not interactive with what oxygen would start. It's the consideration of being in womb. Most people try to fixate that same type of security after womb. And so the looking down, all that kind of stuff, it's not that they're doing something intentionally. It's that they've not trained the intensifying factors. And one of the main intensifying factors is the interbulation of breath, such that you're putting so much fuel in. And in the same way, like a jigsaw puzzle only has one of those one piece, you have to move the one open space. When you add breath, it's not like you're like a SpongeBob and you're like breathing out your skin. It's going into your organs. It's putting into your veins. It's making the pump capable of pumping faster or harder, contingent on what you're looking for. If you can go slower and fuller, you're going to access degrees of parasympathetics and intensity that essentially are equivalent to or equivocable to endurance or increased cardiovascular rate. But that's not possible if your tone is not allowing. If you're stuck in flexion and you don't know how to interbulate comfortably.
Could you define midline for the audience who might not know what the midline is?
So when we talk about deuterosome, I think midline is literally just the mature neural tube. So the neural tube is, before we have a spine, how do we connect bottom to top and reference that this is the structure we're going to form in. Like anytime if someone's going to make something that's like a mask or a body part in latex, they're always going to make a mold. So essentially the neural tube is like the popsicle stick that we kind of mold our spine around, such that we can have a place to put our spinal cord once it matures and once it starts to delineate fascia and starts to like become membranous. So I'd say, without knowing exactly what it looks like when it changes, the neural tube is just an immature and unevolved spine. And that's the midline. Sorry.
But the midline in adulthood, what would that be? Like if you were to describe midline in adulthood, what would that be?
Okay. So the midbrain is your memory encompassing, behavior encompassing limbic system. And your limbic system is your feeling response minus words. So as a baby, why babies have tantrums, but they're still communicating, they're viscerally communicating. They're sharing with you the signaling intensity that they're experiencing or their perception of it. And if they're able to effectively communicate it or endure what things that are naturally intense, there's going to be a degree of like rationalizing how their behaviors make sense in their mind. Now, if we are predisposed to behaviors of the forebrain, we're going to be requiring that there's a emphasis on conscious tone and conscious communication channels. So like how I can use these guys, how I can use my eyes, how I can talk to you guys. Those are like forebrain activities, like higher order functions. In the same way that like when you're running, you consume a tremendous amount of energy. Your brain throughout the day consumes a tremendous amount of energy. It's very similar to or comparable to running a marathon, the activity of your brain. And the more capable your brain is of holding trains of thought. So like for the three of us, we're fairly capable of focusing. We're fairly capable of like conveying things that we may not be able to really understand. And so there's degrees of like maintaining dopamine around focus that a lot of people don't build out. As we get more competent in that, it becomes more dependent on our framework. So like our behavioral reliance on reflex. And if we have the ability to relay back to, I remember doing this, I have a prediction mechanism around these things, then higher order functions requiring you to make decisions in the moment won't take that much energy relative if you were in a panic situation and your midbrain isn't very familiar with the experience. You're going to experience more amygdala upregulation, which is essentially fight or flight, which is essentially adrenal response without the adrenaline. It's like having your experience be paced at a faster rate. Like imagine your daily inside your head song is death metal versus like Coldplay. It'd be the equivocation of like, why is everything inside so intense when outside doesn't really match the experience? And that's largely in my mind the delivery of like, if we're if we have forebrain and hindbrain separated by midbrain, midbrain stability or the construct of signaling here is contingent on the midline or the neck that travels our vagus signals through our organs all the way to our pelvic floor. I equate most of midline with vagus signaling because a lot of the cranial nerves are exclusive to the cranium. Though they convey signaling, they're not like that same delineation of unconscious behavioral relay. They're usually a prescription of conscious tone. So, like if I'm fixed into tensions in my face, my cranial nerves are going to be tight. But if I'm breathing well, my vagus nerve is going to be upregulated enough such that it can tolerate heightened degrees of input without needing me to go into flexion. And
Yeah.
that's the
Anthony?
midline is that versus this, like the lacking awareness, but still you're aware of it by feeling. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts off a couple of things that we kind of touched on there. The idea of, forming from the root up is really interesting, and then how a lot of that awareness comes more from that space that's like, from your heart, your gut, all the way down. I know that a lot of Eastern traditions viewed the mind not in the head but in the heart, and that's where the origin of thought was for a lot of more Eastern traditions, which I always like. It's a very Western idea to think that the brain is the origin of all of our thoughts, because it's like, oh well, that's the processing center, that's where all the nerves are. It's like, so we think that we're in our heads, but the awareness that our experience of ourselves is not just created through this processing center, through this these neural networks. Like there are nerves all throughout our entire body, and this development it does inform a lot of how we feel about ourselves. I think is more intensely subconsciously influential than what we think about ourselves, because usually you can think something about yourself but have no feeling behind it, and it's sort of like an inert thought. It doesn't really have a charge around it, doesn't have any power behind it. But when there's a thought that packs a lot of emotion, that's what actually drives your behavior. And so a lot of the sensory stuff, a lot of the emotions, a lot of the feeling aspects of this existence drives our behavior more than the logical rational thought that we can kind of execute on. And obviously logic should drive our behavior, should drive our decisions, and we should feel certain ways about our logical conclusions, that feeling, as in like the feeling that our logic is correct, is what drives our behavior forward. And so from a practical perspective, I'd love to talk about, like, all right, knowing all of this, having this understanding of the midline, having this understanding of this this neurodevelopmental sequence, how do you take that information and how do you practically apply it to a training setting where you're creating meaningful changes to address some of these qualities?
So going back to how babies, regardless of species, articulate their senses at first, what they're doing is they're making sense of reality. That's why the word and the phrase are they mean the same thing. Making sense of something or sensation is literally just the processing of sensory information. And as we get better at sensing, we don't have to rely on prediction as much, and we don't have to make so many decisions. Reflex is inherently behavioral reliance. And if we don't have habit that is reliable, then we don't have reliable reflexes. But when I'm having people do stuff, I'm really building out their intrinsic reflex supply. So in the same way that I was saying the nose affects the pressure of the face, if we're not pumped in our face, how are we going to know how big the correspondent pressure thresholds are supposed to be in our gut, our pelvis, or so on and so forth? Because there's an immediate relay or mirroring effect of pressure held in the jaw and pressure held in the gut. So like IAP is contingent on this guy right here. Why would that make sense? Well, if you're breastfeeding, how do you convey breast milk down to your gut? You create a vacuous relationship between the tube that allows for you to go through the tubing and not be inhibited by tensions, particularly tensions of uh, where you might coincidentally hold restriction or flexion. Like your suction and midline is all the same thing. Your ability to engorge and pull your midbrain or depth to your midbrain is largely your ability to suction. Like palate depth is not done by the tongue. It's not done by like neck position. It's done by your ability to create suction. And babies who are breastfed and babies who um, are breastfed in an environment such that they can create good vacuous suction, those kids end up with like big jaws. They end up with good development. There's usually a coincidental threshold between how the tongue develops and how the midline develops. And as a tongue starts to be able to create that suction, it's not posture. It's literally the ability to not just circumnavigate breast milk or fluids in the mouth, but your saliva. So one of the most critical relationships between cavities and the teeth aren't from what we eat, it's from latent saliva. Your saliva is acidic and it's hanging out in your mouth. And if it were contributing to your gut, it'd be helping you digest foods instead of helping you digest your teeth. So one of the large things that we do when we have mouth breathing is we don't become aware of how oxidized our tongue is, how much saliva we have here. You can even hear my voice regressing back to it. But people who talk from that, like they're talking from here, they're oxidized tongues. They don't have the ability to breathe through a sinus that is free. Oftentimes, women will whistle with their speech when they talk like that. I don't know why it's exclusively women, but I hear women whistling with it. And for someone that used to have tinnitus, I swear to you, there was nothing that would drive my brain into ringing quicker than hearing someone whistle when they talk.
So,
I don't know if I didn't answer.
So if I was to say, like, the baby suckling, he's trying to get food in his mouth, and I can, like, let's say I narrow it down to that. I'm observing, I'm saying the baby's trying to eat. How do I go from that to adulthood being there a direct connection between the two? Is that an inference that the two are connected?
No, it's the ability to create so if your pressure threshold in your gut is determined by your pressure threshold here, so your cranial nerves contribute to your ability to process downstream. This like top down ability is just that we have a lot of cognizance around our brain which has no sensation. So we have the ability to perceive where we are, and we are the brain and the organ system. And our brain is the thing that perceives everything, but if we don't have the ability to perceive in a safe state how our brain is being fueled, then we have the ability to perceive why it's not being fueled from our face, our neck, whatever it may be. So the way that I dialogue it is our first grip is not the hands, not the feet, it's the latch. And by creating the latch, there's a number of developmental processes you can look at with respect to tongue ties. I used to have a much tighter underside of my tongue. I've worked with a number of people who have tongue ties. The thing that I see no one working with is the musculature of the jaw. I see everyone working with, like, put your tongue in a position, but not how can you resupport your hyoid so it's not supported by your tongue. Instead, it's supported by the vacuum. So I can show you what it looks like on here, but the audience is not going to see it as much. And the relative ability for someone to create suction as an adult starts to articulate how taut their skin is. So I'm like a replacement for Botox or a replacement for a facelift if anyone's very interested in spending some effort instead of spending some money. Still some money involved, but lesser money involvement.
So what about, like, if you say babies who did this have better jaws? So, like, let's say somebody who's bottle fed won't have the jaw development that somebody who's breastfed will. I can see that, but how do you prove that? Like, is there a group of babies that were followed over a period of time, or is it just?
I'm sure
like,
there's a number of
pressure
studies, but to be totally honest with you, there are very few studies that I can, off the top of my head, respect when most of them are privately funded and they're not managed by people who are passionate about the industry. So I could articulate that. I mean, the neural crest thing. It's a recent article in NCB, whatever. You can see a number of the things I've talked about. Look it up, and you'll see a number of articles touching on it. particularly the latch stuff and the tongue tie. Um, but I mean, when you look at it, we're talking about nose breathing, right? And we want to create good nose breath. One of the main ways that we create good nose breath is by closing our mouth. One of the first ways we learn to close our mouth is by going to the nipple. One thing I know a lot of men can't do is seal their lips without biting with their jaw. And there's this obtuscur oris, or this muscle, man muscle around the mouth that's supposed to like chimp our mouth forward. I mean, Anthony kind of has it, but it's very rare for a bunch of dudes to have it. And the way that I see the relationship is one thing that almost every single person I work with dialogues almost immediately. The first thing to take sensation when they do the mewing or the suction or the neck exercise is their three most upper cervical vertebrae. And when we're talking about parasympathetics, our ability to be parasympathetic is analogous to nose breathing. It's analogous to our ability to stay out of flexion, and it's analogous to our whatchamacallit, our vestibular level. And when we start to perceive this kind of like core threshold come to this point, and we can articulate around like a centric point in our head, it no longer becomes bilateral utility of the eyes. It becomes a centrification, almost like a the dual hemispheric behavior becomes a shared hemispheric effort. It becomes more midline. And one thing you can see is, I have a skull in the other room, not a real one, but like one of those demonstrations. You see where the insertion of the spine is where you'd find your palate, and where you'd find suction to the farmost point of your palate if you're like hawking a loogie, for example. So I think some of the things I figured out based off my own experience and being weird in my own body and like playing around with sensations, and a number of the things I also extrapolated from going to people smarter than me, more educated than me, and finding out how they saw my issues and how I could interplay that with a more active relationship. Because if I'm actively ruining my nervous system, why would I passively rehabilitate it? You know what I'm saying? Because the behavior is a habit. It's not like an imprinting of symptoms. It's because I'm doing something.
Okay. Anthony, anything?
Does that make sense? Did that answer your question more or less?
I don't think I answered his
Like
question.
I do want to get into more detail though, like
You're
more
asking
of the neurology,
like clinical relationship.
like no, like we're talking parasympathetics and the vagus nerve, and
Yeah.
like we can say the vagus nerve goes down, so it innervates the tissues, and it's in
Okay.
the midline, and then get more less pressure so that there's more tone in the vagus.
Sure.
I can buy all that, but like what beyond homeostasis? How do you prove beyond homeostasis that is like, how do I put this? Like, there's a homeostatic mechanism, right? If I have less pressure on an area, let's say the vagus nerve that goes through the jugular frame and goes down my body, I don't have the pressure here that's pushing down on the vagus. Beyond that physiological range, if I'm vacuuming my neck, okay, and I can do that, how do I know that that's increasing the tone beyond a homeostatic mechanism?
Well, it's not if you're not breathing, if you're not engaging with that as an upregulatory threshold. So that's what I mean to say. The issue with most people is that their vagus nerve can't stay competent or coherent through the effort. And one of the main things I see as an issue is the dialogue of trying to rotate, like a lot of systems do, the clavicles or the thumbs rotating as opposed to rotating the jugular. It's very similar to like torsion that can happen in a chiropractic session, is that a lot of this torsion can be overdoing tension in the neck. And then so someone, by way of just not having enough volume in their vagus system or vagus nerve, or around their vagus nerve, excuse me, they would be depreciating depth. And one of the main things that I see, respective of, this is the way I equate it: front line, periphery, back line. So periphery is a consideration of not all this, but literally my lungs. My lungs take up that space, and if my arms are doing this, my lungs aren't taking up that space. I'm going into extension not by way of pressure, I'm going into extension by way of signaling my traps to raise my rib is not lifted. So when people stick out their chest, they're sticking their nipples up, but there's no depth of tissue right before their shoulders. And in the same way that we have a butt beneath us, like centering around our sacrum, our sternum is front butt, but because our arms are more dynamic than our lower body is, this is part of our butt. It's like part of that hip supply, and this being that back of hip. Now, if we're contextualizing that we are three-dimensional in our structure around our structure, then we have to be able to articulate three-dimensionality in the limb at every juncture. What I see as being the biggest lack thereof in, say, FP, for example, I can say any system, it's not them exclusively, but they have a lot of the high shoulder people. As soon as you do this, you've taken off the responsibility of your upper lungs for holding up your rib cage. Not only that, you've put extension into your lat such that if you're not conveying the proper tone or the proper depth to this area, there's going to be some reciprocal reaching effect down by the lumbar. And because this isn't getting signaling, the top upper cervical is not getting signaling, the two parasympathetic points in the body relative to the spine are the upper cervical and the sacrum. And so the remainder of like the thorax, the mid body, is where sympathetics exist. So if that's not accounted for, we're going to be sympathetic. And if we can't stabilize that, we're not going to earn parasympathetics. So the way, just by noting that, I garnered that flexion, although it is not as excitable as inhalations, it is the precursor to extension, meaning we have to base off flexion to be able to extend. And if we can't stay safe while we're extending, we're not going to be adequately extending. And one of the mainstays that is required for us to extend through ranges we can't really create tone through, taking the air out of it. Because if we're too oxidized, there's going to be a neural response without there being a tonal pressurization. So if I hang out here and I'm not suctioned or vacuous, whatever tissue I have in that ambience is probably going to prolapse to a degree outside of its compression, and there's going to be a degree of action away from the spine. And so that's why you see so many people doing that spinal rotation, and their spine looks like it's swimming instead of staying more braced. Because you think about it, your organs are dancing if your spine is swimming. It is still spinal engine. It's just not spinal engine from the spine. It's into the spine. Your engine is processing all the kinetic force and redistributing it to the points that can rotate and offload it. But it's like the Pavlov press, kind of. But it's being able to reticulate that the first perturbation is not movement outside of you. When you inhale, you're perturbating everything. You're perturbating every single part of your neurology. And if you're not breathing well, if you're not getting a deep breath, you'll notice that when people like talk to an extended period of time, there's a depreciation of the resonance. So their ability to project their voice depreciates because the constriction or the lack of oxygenation while they're projecting their voice, it's like an out and in. There's not enough in for how much out there is. So in being able to get more out or projective, what I'm doing is I'm not like working with the out, I'm pushing through my gut. And the more that my lungs can start to re-perpetuate breathing down while I'm speaking out, I'm still creating the atmosphere of being able to engage or create gravity. And the thing that gave me this ability was suction.
So let's talk about some of the different training stimulus, because like in terms of the practical application of this was all things that kind of started to make more sense to me as I was actually doing some of the practices. So I'd love to talk about the different applied stimulus response and adaptations that happen in some of your training system. Obviously, suction is a really, really big one. If people buy your mewing course, for example, they have a lot of the practice around that that hyphoid process, that suction, that vacuuming effect, and actually creating that structural, I'm going to call it foundation of suction.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because there the tangible effects that you feel on the integration of your body when you apply some of this stuff. And I really want to emphasize that if this seems a little heady to you as you're listening to this, there's like the experiential component of this method can't be understated. Like it's something that like you kind of have to feel, and that's the joke about a sensory based practice is that there's you have to engage your sensory
Yeah.
experience into it, right? And so, in terms of some of the stimulus, obviously suction is a big one, but some of the posture under pressure stuff is some of the stuff that fascinated me most. Can you talk about some of the different stimulus and techniques that you apply, what your intention behind them is, and what the adaptations that are being created from those particular stimulus?
Yeah, I mean, when I was first learning midline, I had the pleasure of learning from two guys who own their own gym. One since passed, Chris Daly, and Dave Sten. Chris passed a little bit over a year and a half ago. Um, when I had first hit my head, there were a number of things I looked into. I was really excited by like rope flow, so I got to Weck method stuff, and I was like, oh, there's someone who's frenetic like me, highly turbulent, seemingly someone that doesn't know how to sit still without being everywhere at once. And I was like, I'd love to figure out how this person got so successful and has so much of a following, and why I resonate with certain things. And because I'm so about learning someone's own grasp on their reality, like why they decided to be the way they are, not why they happen to be the way they are. I went and I learned from him, and I asked him a bunch of questions, and I found out that dissimilar to me, he's kind of accepted certain things and didn't want to figure out why he was affected by maybe his injuries or affected by his own behaviors, and I wanted to, because I since a young age I was criticized at home by uh, people who were, I guess, less emotional, or uh, going through different things. I'd lost my mom at a young age, and there were degrees of like reaction that I had that I didn't know how to like exhaust myself of. So I got really intense, and I got very comfortable being intense, but that in essence makes people uncomfortable. So I got comfortable making people uncomfortable from a young age, and I think that's one of the thresholds that I think most people need to foster, because until such time as we feel good about who we are and how we are, there's always going to be this second guessing or questioning about our own intrinsic decision making process. Like, where does it come from? Am I making the right decisions? Who do I trust more than myself to trust the answer to that question? And I couldn't, because people around me weren't as loving as my mom was, and I didn't feel like I could create or refacilitate that same kind of naturing for. I trust this person. I know. Since I wasn't competent enough to speak for my feelings, I had to have someone capable of making that safe for me. And what I fostered through a lot of my own struggle in the last few years, when my head injuries got worse, was I started to recall more experiences like when I was younger, when I had hyperstimulation and I got too panicky and I got my ears ringing and I got light sensitivity and I got like my thoughts screaming in my head. And I would say to my parents, I'm having this, and I would go to therapy, but they never had an answer for me, because uh, um, extrasensory behaviors, or like what's it, neurodysregulation, is not something that people call neurodysregulation. They call it OCD, they call it depression, they call it anxiety, they call it ADD, they call it ADHD, but they don't say it's a neurological disrepair. Like, it's not like something's firing at an issue rate. And I mean, when I look back on it, we had a fire in my house when I was a little kid. I had a baby sister pass away when I was an infant. And if I didn't get affected, the people around me did. And the behaviors that I was watching be habituated got affected. So I was watching things that were traumatized or not very in communication with it. The breathing was different. The eye motion was different. Everything that I saw as a mirroring effect that would teach me how to gesticulate was faster than it should have been. And because I was working from that threshold, I perceived the world at a faster rate, but I was never comfortable in my perception there. And it wasn't until I had to slow down and I couldn't sorry, excuse me. getting a little emotional thinking about it.
All
I
good.
couldn't figure out how I could work through my intensity. COVID had just happened. I was working out of a gym that I no longer was working out of. I just bought a camper thinking I was going to go travel. And then all of a sudden I don't have an income, and you can't park campers in Southern California without every cop and Karen telling you that this is not where they belong. So I had like a nice truck with like a rooftop, whatever, and I felt like a homeless person living in a space that I'd spent a lot of money, and like I felt terrible, and I was like enclosed, and it's like a prison experience. So I started to realize that my acceptance of stimulus, my acceptance of circumstance was just habit. It wasn't because I knew I deserved better, but I didn't know how to get better without exhausting my environment. So I knew I had to fix my ability to communicate without losing my ability to perceive and observe. So my rate of perception couldn't depreciate, but I needed to improve how I was perceived by others. And so I spent a lot of time figuring out how I could breathe better, but still maintain my competency. And I went from I probably was borderline handicapped with how my brain was functioning at a point, to being back to where I feel like I'm high functioning. And I don't feel like I have the symptomology that would have made me guess when I was younger, hey, am I potentially on the spectrum? Am I figuring out some degree of like um, disrepair or injury that no one in my family has? Like, what's going on? Why is it that I can't figure this out? Well, I hit my head. My midline wasn't working dual hemispherically. It was working bilaterally, and it was working with tensions prescribed to my sympathetic side. And so my smile was weird. Like I would smile and I'd like have to resist the want for my face to pull really fast on the right side, and then I'd have to resist like I because this side was tight. I raised my eyebrow thinking that I was bringing the tissue together. There were a bunch of degrees of like lacking awareness and how my mirror was broken, and I was showing people a busted mirror.
Yeah, during times of turbulence, it's always the time of growth, right? And it sounds like you did that. So that's awesome.
Maybe 20 years of that. I just started calming down, so I'm starting to appreciate the value of that. It wasn't nice beforehand.
So
uh,
relating that to the, in terms of the stimulus that you directly apply to a training setting, it like that, the stress tolerance and that comfort with discomfort, and those are all themes that I'd noticed in terms of some of the positions that we would get in, and that when you're maintaining your own posture and you're holding a particular position, you're also pushing against an external pressure while
Yeah.
maintaining an internal equilibrium, an internal sense of pressure. So it almost feels like you're filling yourself up against the pressures of the world, and that theme shows up over and over again in the training setting. At least that's what I observed.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you noticing that, because that was what I was doing. The world was on my shoulders, and I was collapsing under the weight of it. And I wanted to project my voice and feel strong again, dude. I wanted to feel how I felt inside, not diminished and in pain. I had migraines every day and sensitivity to things that I didn't, and I was having trouble. Like, uh, if women could find me attractive, but I was having trouble finding myself attractive, what was the disrepair? Not every woman, obviously, but I'm saying, like, if I could rationalize, like, if I'm likable to some people, if I'm likable to the opposite sex, and there's a degree of normalcy there, and I'm likable to my friend group, and they know me, and where is the disrepair? And it was the threshold. It was the tone that I would take on, the behavior. Like, I see someone I don't know, and there were things that I would automatically prescribe that would make me more intense. When I say pace earlier, like the frequency of behaviors or perceptions, if you can perceive stimulus at a rate faster than the stimulus is happening, then you're probably not going to be interpolated by the stimulus such that you try to outpace it. But majority of us put tone into our body because we're trying to think through actions faster than we can act through them. And when we do that, we prescribe the vibration. Literally, it's the countenance of higher frequency energetics into the area. So let's say vibration for the sake of simple science, not vibe. Like, ooh, yeah, your vibe is good, but I'm saying literally your vibratory mechanism, how you're putting effort through there. Things are vibrating and moving at an undulation that you can brace through, but it's moving such that you can articulate the finer motor control or motor articulation of the vehicle without recruiting everything at once. And that vibration, similar to like erosion, when we put pressure into our body, when we're adequately pacing our intensity, it's like we're saturating soil. Instead of the soil having a bunch of cracks and fissures where we can put our force through, it's going to be irrigated. It's going to have the ability for like almost that permeable action where we can start to lymphatically reduce or pressure reduce from the waste spilling out of our hands and our arms and our sweat. And we can start to majority of our waste should be leaving from our breath and our our coughing, our breathing, our exhales. But because most of us exhale like and we stay tight in our gut, we're not actually reducing waste. We're reducing volume. So if we were to start to gutturally exhale and exhale from like a steady pelvic floor, there'll be a lot to say. And I can tell you, just having a lot of these things just renature in me, dude, I got way stronger in a body that's 40 pounds lighter than it was. And I feel way more masculine in a lot of ways. Like my face is starting to retake shape. There are degrees of sensation I've not had since I was maybe a kid or ever. And so like a mature head on me, I won't have like that boy face comment anymore. Like, yeah, dude, growing up, always just very boy face. You have a very pretty boy face. Well, now that I'm an adult, don't say that. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Let's talk pressure. In terms of like I've heard you say the term breathe through your butt.
Yeah.
So could you unpack that maybe anatomically and talk about like the pressure around it and how you understand it?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. I think that there's a base underlying pressure that we don't have that is counter the mechanisms that most of us want to have in place to be breathing well, to be standing well, to be existing in a reflexive posture system. With respect to the motion of our diaphragm, there's a degree of separation. So before I give you my explanation, when you inhale, what happens to your diaphragm in a textbook answer?
Goes up.
Okay. So one of the main things that provides it the ability to go up is the attachment to the lungs, and the lungs filling up the rib cage and essentially creating an extensive nature off the diaphragm. So weighing off the diaphragm's connective fascia. And the only way that that can happen is twofold. Shoulders can't be ingressing the lungs such that the lungs are starting to push fully. And so you're able to go into extension away from the psoas, because if your shoulders are internally rotated, then your psoas is not going to be marking that anchoring. And if you're not anchoring your diaphragm, then there's not going to be like this fixture of tension you feel transitioning from your abdominal wall into your diaphragm. It's just going to feel like when you breathe, your chest rises, but it doesn't involve your abdomen. One thing that I emphasize is that we have to prescribe a degree of swallow or down before we can let the diaphragm come up. So the esophagus runs through our diaphragm. And for many of us with rib flare, I prescribe that as being the esophagus not running through the diaphragm well and it having a prolapse. So a little bit of like a rise here, instead of the rise being at that manubrium, it's at the base of the sternal wall. And so it's happening at the solar plexus area where the midbrain is most reactive, which is to say, if this area is experiencing pressure as opposed to the spine behind it, the diaphragm behind it, we know we're not in a stable state, and we have to garner more flexion to brace back our breathing and our organs. That's going to be a huge indicator of instability. That's why the solar plexus is such a neuroresponsive area. As soon as it becomes inflamed, our midbrain or our amygdala starts to become inflamed and reactive. So inflammation of that like end of esophagus, start of diaphragm, is a translation of how does our solar plexus relate to gravity. If it's lifted, then there's degrees of backside that isn't anchored, or a backbone or spine isn't braced through the juncture of thorax and lumbar. So that transition point of where our diaphragm is, where it's connecting 2 points, that psoas, or upper body and lower body, isn't connecting. And one of the main things that we have to prescribe before we go into extension from our pelvic floor is we have to inundate the pressure that we're including in our trunk downward. So I swallow when I first have people breathe. I have them swallow to register where the swallow goes, and then I want for them to inhale as if they're prescribing a pushing mechanism on top of that swallow to help that swallow deepen. And when they exhale, I want them to retain that measure. So it's like once they've gotten past the diaphragm from the swallow and the inhale, the exhale is going to essentially prevent it from escaping. Most people, when they exhale, it's all escaping air. So when we get that to start prescribing, it's like the Valsalva maneuver. It secures our core, gets us to be a little more three-dimensional around this juncture so we don't have to rotate our spine. We get to rely on the rotational vectors of our rib. And then as soon as we get to that threshold, this is where Wim Hof comes into play, or the study of clinical. You look at the clinical studies around Wim Hof, it's all about his intercostal tissue. I think we went over this last time, maybe we didn't. But that threshold of being able to distend that while still creating internal extension takes the ribs from being in like a rolled over state to being spread while they have this buoyancy. So they, like the hand should, all the fascia that connects their adducting qualities or their abducting qualities is interrelated. So everything stretches at the same threshold, which is what we want when we're bringing air in. As soon as that happens, then we have like the ability to push pressure into our core. And core is a maintenance of core temperature. That's what the word core roots from. So if we're talking about intercostals, and Wim Hof articulates that his ability to maintain his health is from the heat he garners from his intercostals, but he's always belly breathing and there's not a stability to his core, then you can't say that it's a stabilizing effort. It's like a intensifying effort. I wanted to make it so that translated to the core. And once it did, very much like the dantian, or like creating the lower dantian and building out an energy cycling core, my ab wall started to round like my rib cage, started to get more deep, and then my back started to get tighter and narrower. I was always very broad, like a square, like a brick, and now I'm getting that pizza slice kind of shape, and it's starting to feed into my groin better, which articulates that down pressure into my pelvic floor, which is where butt breathing comes into play. So that long-winded answer was we have to create the syringe to be able to resupply the vacuum. When I say vacuum, it's different than suction. Suction involves air, vacuum doesn't. So the suction helps us prescribe a degree of downstream extension. That is, even though it looks like I'm getting taller, I'm applying more pressure down the midline. I'm applying it down the esophagus into my core, retaining it there. Once that residuates more pressure, it starts to expand. Everything starts to saturate. So like reperfusion, when you do something with a client, you're like change something minutely and you feel an area reperfused and it's like, oh, there's a pump there now. That's what I'm doing, but I'm treating the centric midline and the vagus system like a resupply point for our greatest atmosphere. And once that starts to become heavy, then we can, from our pelvic floor, and in the same way that we articulate our arches, and the same way we articulate our palate, we're prescribing suction, or in the case of down there, we're flexing it and turning it into a vacuum that pulls up through our butt. So our pelvic floor, the depth that came from our breath, is redistributing down, back, and in. So extension is going to be a byproduct of how much we can push down and then essentially restack atop that down while the cork or the drain is plugged. And that's actually a shared concept. Anthony told me this. He gave me the name for it if you wanted to rename it again, because I don't remember. Mandabara.
Mula Bandha, like the
Thank you.
yoga. Yeah. So yoga has these different energy locks, right? And it's kind of, they have this upward draw of the perineum, and they have Uddiyana Bandha, which everyone says is a chin tuck, but when you combine it with a tongue bhaga, which is like the proper positioning of your tongue, it's actually like a suction, and it kind of, you have it's not quite like tucking your chin like this. It's
Yeah.
blocking your energy. And then there's just kind of a few inches under your belly button is like almost like a sacral lock that they call. And so those are the three principal energy locks that they try to get you to focus on when you're doing a classical asana practice, like one of the traditional yoga practices that's more energy oriented. That's kind of what you would end up doing.
Real quick, that's reflexive inhibition. So when you were talking about like creating action here, when you're opening up this tissue, what has to happen is for the spine to stay stable or the midline to stay stable, there's going to be a reflexive point, like a mirroring point that stabilizes or becomes more tonal to replace the tone that may have been carried here. So when we're doing that, what they're doing is they're stimulating the sacrum, the upper cranial vertebrae, and then if you're doing some stimulus down at the belly, or you're intoning at the same time, like saying words like hum, rum, bum, those kinds of things, you're doing the same neural stimulus, but you're doing it in a way that helps you oxygenate. And I think the same way that the massage gun is allowant for you to like create certain tensions, those words are allowant for you to create better allocation of pressure. Maybe it's in an organ, maybe it's in a region, but I think that like you're doing different guttural motions. So anytime you're even thinking words, your throat is moving for those words. So there's always a reflexive action to, you know?
When you say reflexive, just for the audience, could you give a definition, maybe even like a neurological definition of how you see it?
I think a good example would be a snake. If their head's cut off and they're still like like wriggling around, or if they've died and they're still having their what is it called, the after death response? What would you call that?
I'm not sure.
Not sure.
I forget what it's called, but regardless, it's a deep spinal response. It's like all the nerves that are still actively charged are sending signals, even though the brain's dead. So while you might see someone who's just passed away and they're moving or something, or a fish that's died and it's still moving, or particularly invertebrates, like I would actually think like, sorry, not invertebrates, particularly things in the water. You'll see fish, you'll see various things that aren't shaped like us. When you've killed it, it starts to shake, it starts to move a little bit, or there's still like after twitches. We are semiconductors. We are electrical posts. So when you say backbone, it's literally a conduit channel. And the better that you can have, the better melanated your nerves are. I don't know if I said it right. Better sheathed they are in their protective coating, which is largely made from fat, the better you're going to be able to insulate against your intrinsic heat. So that core temperature is contingent on your ability to resupply nerves with blood flow that's fully nutritious. So there's going to be some fat. There's going to be those things that resupply those nerves with their coating. There's also going to be things that help you secure like an equilibrium of buoyancy, so you don't have to create tone and give your nerves other jobs aside from just perceiving. And then there's going to be the action of like swallowing, for example, is a reflex. Your eyes watering is a reflex. Salivation is a reflex. Those are primary parasympathetic reflexes that I want for people to have, but most people do not. And that's why they struggle projecting. That's why they struggle with their eyes. That's why they struggle with a variation of things, because their body doesn't lubricate at the rate that they burn it. So it's like an engine with oil, kind of. And so reflex is essentially anything non-conscious that's acting on its own autonomically or in support of your system that should be happening without your say-so. And as we get more, the older we get, you see a lot of older men that don't have to move a lot, but they can create a lot of force. It's because their systems are really behaviorally tolerant, and they have tremendous amount of reflex prescribed to all the different behaviors within that mechanism. So you could do a lot of things that may cause an injury for someone younger because they have more variability. And for someone with like fixed reflex, maybe the tone is very limiting to try new things. Maybe it isn't, but that reflex is going to be very, very engaged when you're doing the thing it's expecting to do. And that's why there's so many systems that say, hey, move like this so you can continue moving like this. But reflexes are not conscious, and that's my biggest issue with that.
One other like little anecdote that I found really useful to understanding reflexes, like if a person sits down and has to imagine themselves standing up, and they keep mentally rehearsing themselves standing up, but at some point they actually have to stand up, and so they just keep repeating this like mental image of themselves standing up. When they actually decide to stand up, their body will pretense before the thought of before the decision to do the actual thing happens. So they're reflexively knowing that they're going to, like, their intention is faster than their thought of doing the thing. So like when you and I talk about the idea of intent can happen faster than the speed of thought in a lot of cases, right? Like that's kind of reflex. Like when you're doing the ropes and stuff and you feel you have your next move, reflex is just going to the next move without you thinking, okay, well, I'm going to turn left now, that's kind of how I have it's just your body's ability to self-organize in a way that your conscious mind doesn't have time to get in the way of.
Yeah, I think that the dictionary definition of reflex, like the actual neurological definition of reflex and the way that people use it, are two different things. One, the neurological reflex is going through the spinal cord and not through the cortices, like not through the actual cortices of the brain. So it's a loop that just goes without hitting the brain, where people think about reflex as something fast, but it may not be the same thing because it's going to the brain. It's consciously getting through that loop back to the brain. So that's just a definitions thing, right? But what was my question there? I lost my train of thought on that question, but I'll come back to it. Any thoughts on that, Nate?
No, I mean, I'm in agreement with your definition. Spinal
sorry.
reflex.
Yeah, sorry, I remembered the question. So when you go to a regular MD, or even we were taught this in chiropractic, I'm sure every health professional is taught it, is the cranial nerve exams, or the just nerve exams in general. We'll take cranial nerve exams for example. You test reflexes. You test the uvula, you test the ciliary reflex, you test the reflex of the facial nerve, you test hypoglossal nerve, you test all the reflexes, right? So when they're in physiological homeostasis, then that would be, medically, you're good to go, right? Like you don't have a deficit there. It's not an issue.
Good to go.
Well, you don't look further, right? Like in terms of
that context is like no one contextualizes tone of vagus nerve. No one contextualizes the quality of inputs in the same way sensory profile would. It's clinical observation of sensation, clinical observation of non-thinking. So you're assessing reflex, which you can absolutely, but you can't assess the reflexive behavioral profile, or how they contextualize the behavior. And that's where, look, if we're talking reflex is oftentimes a behavior around comfort or around flexion. How can you constrict in a comfortable environment without also inundating sympathetic? So it's suction, it's womb flexion, those kinds of things.
Can I stop you for a second? How would you know that though? Like how do you actually know that? How do you test that?
The fetal response and anything that resupplies. I mean, when you're talking about what a cramp is, you're talking about going into contraction beyond the state of maintenance, or beyond the state of like tolerable stability. And for most of us, we can flex very easily. We flex to extend. Like most of us are creating a separation of things. When you lose out on vestibular coordination, and you lose out on like where you are in space, the first thing most of us do is we go into fetal position. So it's not even like a reflex of let me protect myself. It's like I need to breathe better. I want to feel more comfortable. I feel overwhelmed and tensioning. Even if this is the fetal position I'm in, like I'm just like hugging my belly. I've tucked my pelvis. My spine is now curved. Now I've created some flexive response. And I think there is an umbilical response, or a response a neurodevelopmental response that's pre-associated with it, that's fetal or uh, answers that question for you. But I'm highly confident that flexion, in the same way that it's safe inducing, it's our prescriptive effort to create action. And if we don't have a reflexive habit around something, we are going to flex to manage it. We're going to not reflex, doing it as a secondhand action of flexion, but we're going to be doing it as a firsthand cognizance of flexion. And I mean, like, the tone of our faces is the best indicator of it. Like, I've got these bags that have indicated that my head has been pulled into flexion, but it doesn't go into extension as easily, right? These aren't wrinkles. These are like, they're saggy. And that's a byproduct of like too much weight on the fascia, despite me needing to use this level. So we're inherently flexible because it's pro gravity. It's I'm coming back to the thing that acts without oxygen, and that's the butt and pelvis. We're going down to our pelvis. Our flexion is literally the bringing of two ends together. Like, you're creating a measure of baby or womb position.
So, like for bags under the eyes, is that the case all the time, or is there other
Oh,
reasons you would prescribe for it?
No, you guys still have head impaction. Like, I mean, Anthony was working with me. He felt where his head was expanding, but it's not the same place that I have it. I have wide cheekbones, but my jaw was recessed because I hit my head. My head couldn't go into extension off of the scalp, the ears, and the eyebrow, so it was trying to go to extension off the motion of my bite, and I was gripping my spine as opposed to bracing my spine. And until we can start to grip our spine, there's going to be no actualization of pressure regulation at that level. So I used to have really bad ringing in my ears. No wonder my head was like drawn down, and I used to have light sickness and like migraines. I didn't even know what migraines were until I started to understand that the severity of headache I was having had a description or like a specification of what type of headache I was getting. My brother was like talking as a kid. He said he was getting migraines. They've all been like hit in the face with like golf clubs. And I have four older brothers that were just regularly lightsabering each other in the face with metal implements. I didn't have that. I did that on my own with a bike and stuff. But yeah, as soon as you start to compact those points and you're not redistributing pressure, and so there's tension here, and I'm not breathing into my right eye, and alleviating those points that aren't perfusing, as soon as they perfuse, like you say, they come back to an equilibrium. But equilibrium is very easy to. It's like we're very good at making equilibrium whatever it is at our baseline. So intensifying is the hard thing. Reduction is super easy. Less pressure, awesome. I'd love to have less pressure in my body to relax and not have to have stimulus everywhere. But truthfully, once you get the stimulus, you kind of become stimulus. Uh, you do become stimulus in need of stimulus. Like, you become active enough such that you need more activity to justify your ability to maintain these reflexes. Like, you can't rely on the thinking of how I used to do it. And I used to be able to do a lot of stuff, but as soon as my head became bigger and there was more demand on my neck to grow, all those flex points that are maybe lower in my spine started to really pull on my face. This is an extension point. This is like a huge extension point for the palate lifting, your spine coming up, the posterior expansion. Like, one thing that I talk to clients about is attack ears, like your dog ears, making your ears alert. And that's if your ears can't go alert, or if they sit off the side of your head and they're forward and they're not very aerodynamic, it's to suggest that you're not creating the proper articulation of tissue from chest to the back of your head. And I've seen it with a number of clients. Like, one client came in today, and mid-session, he's like, "Can we book next week's session already?" And he was, before it, like, talking about his tinnitus, talking about whatever in his ear. And I was like, "You're about to feel heat in your ear." He's like, I kind of feel it. And then all of a sudden, whoa. And as soon as your vagus nerve starts to re-perfuse, it's tangible, dude. It's like you can listen to your periphery instead of having to look at everything. And once that this becomes more tangible, your periphery does engage a lot more. And then as that becomes more tangible, your shoulders can start to become the side of your body. Your lats can come back on your back instead of being halfway over on your rib cage. Your hips don't have to be internally rotated. They can start to externally rotate and recompress your sacrum, and your sacrum can drop out without tucking because there's enough extension there. But sacrum and sternum are coincidental features for my system. Like if you're not getting enough motion out of this free floating structure with ligament and tendon attachments all over it, but very little bone interaction, then the same thing's happening in the sacrum. So a lot of motion is contingent on the behavior of the heart, which is, there's some part of my book, and this is another study that's been on the heart. The heart is a organ that proves we are social creatures more than we are thinking creatures. So what I mean by that is we have a social engagement process that suggests that our vagus nerve innervates our face and our heart and corresponds the feelings of our heart with the emotions of our face. And so the midline is directly interactive with social conductive behaviors. You can look up social engagement process or social engagement something, I forget exactly, and heart and cranial fascia. You'll see it's also in the book, so I recommend everyone get the book and get certified.
Cool. In terms of like breathing into the eye, could you give us an example, like a practical demonstration of how one would go about that? Because if I say that to somebody, they'd be like, "What are you talking about? Breathing
Totally.
into the eye?" Yeah.
Yes. So palming is a good way to precurse it. So if you're familiar, you put your palms in your eye, and you learn to depreciate the sensitivity, or like that light, like washing feeling when you see the flashing of lights behind your eyes. Our eyes are too, in my opinion, oxidized and too hemorrhaged from our head or prolapse from our head, and they need to rearticulate back and then fill out the bone structure of our eye socket. And in creating better nose breath, you're creating more nitric, you're creating fuller sinuses. The sinuses by themselves are going to do that for you, but we want to be able to feel it and articulate the effort without making it feel kind of nonsensical. The way I articulate to people is pretend you're on a bike, you're feeling like the wind is brushing against your eyes, and you're articulating the wind is pacing at the rate that you're breathing. So you don't want to feel your eyes shooting to the back of your head. You want to feel your eyes kind of like drinking kind of some pressure into the back of your head. So that's smelling breath, and you're smelling the wind pass into your eyes and feeling them cool a little bit. And that's one thing that oxygen should do. It should cool your system. So if it's not, like we say, it is an irritant. So if it's an oxidized area instead of an oxygenated area, there's probably not enough nitric present, or there's too much CO2 present. So we want to be able to essentially hold the breath here and let this area expand a little bit. And one of the ways we can do that is doing this, learning how to smell with your breath a little bit more, or some of the vacuous stuff with the suction. When you start to get your palate to feel like it's pulling upward, it makes your sinus feel robust from underside. So depends on what state you're at, and I would definitely work with a bunch of different things with people. But a couple ways you can feel it are like one exercise from my mewing course. That's chipmunk cheeks, and once you have that big space filled up, you're breathing into the vacuum. You're not trying to breathe into this space. You're trying to expand this space, and once your sinus starts to take on that fullness, despite you keeping your airway full, you'll start to feel this predisposition to stretching the superficial layer of your face, I guess. And then that's going to come with the ears, that's going to come with the eyebrows. But I guarantee you, most people don't have that action, because these guys, if you guys feel the side of your head, right as it transitions from side of head to top of head, you'll probably feel like it tapers really quickly, like your headphones do. They get very round, very quick. And my head is almost to the top of it, tall. So it doesn't like soften inward, very round like this anymore, because I can start extending through my palate and creating degrees of extension past my upper cervical vertebrae that play into the cranial sutures and the fascia that essentially pulls me down and in.
So do you think there's room for expansion of the cranium? Like, do you think the sutures are not fused? Because I look at a lot of x-rays, and I know the physiological sutures, like it for the audience, physiological sutures are the bones inside articulating, not the fontanelles, which are outside. I know these ones are usually fused when I actually see it on x-ray, right? But the inside has a lot of variability. I've asked radiologists this question, and yeah, some people are fused at 18, some people are fused at 50. Do you think the cranium has room for expansion in a major way on most people?
Yeah, 100%, a million percent,
Yeah.
2 billion%.
And
So
what makes you
I have
believe
proof
that?
I have proof on this.
Yes,
So I'm
let's hear
working
it.
with an osteo. He's my clinical director. He's
Mhm.
a practicing PT. He's been doing um, what is it? Osteo, PT, and then uh, essentially some degree of like craniosacral with his practice. But what he's been doing
Okay.
for me is helping me reperfuse areas that have been stuck. I've been doing a more active version with him, and we're developing a system that helps people articulate activity through passivity. So not necessarily how do you resist your clinician, but how can you do this in a MovMed setting? Um, and he's been working with elderly patients using these. We have more definite cues in the clinical setting, but we haven't written out that process yet. That's going to be the next book, the next cert. But I wanted to get the basics down. The thing we're going to talk on is he's worked with 80-year-olds. He works with all these elderly people. He's not just talking to me about the 40-year-old that comes in, the 15-year-old that comes in. He's talking to me about all of his elderly patients. Every single one of these midline things, not the midline thing, just midline general, but we have a instead of the planes, we've replaced it with an X that cuts us into quadrants, and it translates to the body. I don't want to demonstrate it here because I don't think I'll do a good job on the visual, but we're going to start to create a visual for it. And through that X, starting to orient that the relationships between like coincidental or inhibitory points or like counteractioning points are directly synonymous through people, even if they're out of the range of recoverability, which is to suggest that we are always recoverable. It's probably going to be a little traumatic to recover past certain suture closures or certain like bone fusing efforts. But same way that our bone can absorb itself, it's going to reabsorb itself because the nerves are still there, unless the nerves depreciate and then there's like no recycling of perception. Like nervous system is our perception. That's like our shape. And so if the nerves are in through all those points, in through all those junctures or sutures or lining them, then we have the ability to at least perceive where we can apply better pressure because there's an actual channel to put pressure through, right? My thinking is that as we get more equal through that pressure system, yes, you can. It's going to be way harder to do on someone that's older, but it's very, very possible.
So the bone itself is growing, or the sutures between the bone is
The,
what's expanding? Is that
I would say
the
the
like
fascial presentation, the separation between things is growing, and then you're finding out the suture wasn't gone. It was impressed on itself, so it was like very, very heavily compressive to protect what part was still pressurized. So, like
okay?
where you feel like your head is kind of rounded here, that's like this side of your head being rounded. So, if you look at like where the glasses go, my head is very wide from here to here. The thing that I'm working on is getting my hyoid better supported through my neck because my forehead has been narrow. So as this starts to broaden again, it's going to lift in a broad fashion, and then the bones that are underneath are going to start to come out again. But that's usually what it is. Like it's the ribs, it's the ingression of bones or the overlaying of bones. Like uh, the fascia not being like layered like layer A, layer B, layer C. It's like intermeshed spider webbing that's been twisted and bundled like a Shrek cotton candy.
Okay.
So bad.
Yeah. Interesting. Like you do see what guys on steroids, their head grows, right? Like a lot of
Yeah.
uh people on steroids. I'm not going to say every guy because I don't know, right? But you definitely do witness that. So I mean,
Well,
that's
they're not
interesting
pressurized.
in
I don't think
itself.
their skull is growing as much as it is the superficial structure. So a lot of the active tissue
Hmm.
that they can muscle through, and then the skull itself still kind of stays small. So one thing you'll see is a lot of those bodybuilders have really flat backs of their heads, and they
Mm.
don't have tremendously square jaws. They usually have very childlike features that have been like warped to be really wide. So it's still like a baby face on like a kind of a spread head. And
Interesting. We'll have
yeah,
to
and
take a look.
you'll see. I promised
Yeah.
you when you start to just testing the scalp. All right, your scalp should. My scalp is still short. Like I said, it's not fully full, but yours, if you grabbed it, if it moves, it's going to move a lot more than mine, and that's just relative what I'm seeing. Relative, yeah, and there's lesser thickness there. So when mine moves, see how it moves with like an evenness all the way down to like almost my ears, and you can feel how there's like different degrees of fascial tension when you grab yours. That's going to be,
Uh, I've worked on mine quite a bit, so
yeah,
it might be
it moves
skewed.
nice, but it's not very
Yeah.
muscled, which is what I'm saying. Like you can see right here, your scalp isn't raising high enough. I just imagine there's some impaction you have at like jaw level such that the fascia is similarly impacted, not because you can't, but because something is in tone that needs to reduce tone. So it might be this guy right here. You have way too much tone next to your left nostril, your parasympathetic side. So I would suggest that learning how to depreciate the tone right here.
What do you mean the parasympathetic side? Like, yeah, you have
Sympathetic,
a like.
right?
Do most people have a sympathetic and parasympathetic side, or are you saying that because you see me uneven, that there's one sympathetic and one parasympathetic side?
No, our nostrils have that innervation. So that's why we do alternate
What's
nostril
that? What's
breathing.
that?
Right being sympathetic, left being parasympathetic. And then
Interesting.
the
Interesting.
structuring I relate to that is that because we're not equivocating enough pressure here, right? And because the heart has more reference to the lung, there's more perturbation on this side. Like we're more clearly perceptive of what happens on this side, which is why most of us have a basing left leg and an overly rotated right side. Like right now, you're leaning toward your right side, but your right side is leaning toward your left side. I guarantee to
I'm
you,
on
you
a
have.
I'm on a desk here. I'm
Uh,
leaning on the desk.
okay, yeah, but even still, the practice of what side you're going to lean to is what side you're going to have more basing weight. So, like, I wouldn't lean on my left side either. I'd also lean on my right side, but I would lean
If
on
I
my left.
lean on my right side, I'm gonna fall over.
Well, no, you work. You have the. That's what I'm saying. Like your limbs, even if you're not perceiving it, your spine is rotated where you have that collapse of shoulder.
I'm literally on an angle. The camera's faced this way because I had to because the room is
Okay.
a weird shape, so I had to twist myself. Which actually goes to a question we had. Me and you went back and forth in the comments section back, and it was a Connor Bernard pull-up video, right? And I was like, pull-ups aren't a great way to test athleticism in hockey,
Yeah.
and basically it was a picture of Connor Bernard. Actually, he had his chin tucked, and I was like, from a still frame, he could have been cued in that position, and you're like, it doesn't matter. The midline's the midline. So how do you see, like, on a still picture, how do you know that he wasn't cued into that position, and does it even matter? Like, what was your point of view on that one? Because I still don't get it.
Because most people, when they create pressure, absolve pressure in their head immediately. So one of the first things people do, I do it. Everyone does it to a degree. I kind of had to mitigate it. But realistically, if you're not open to extension, if you're not receiving the pressure of breath, you're doing that. Meaning to say, if while you're breathing, your face doesn't change at all, a little bit more buoyancy, it stays in its fixture. It means the fascia isn't breathing with the rest of you. So when he does that, when I say before, this prescribes tension to your gut, he's trying to create a brace to where his lat is pulling off of immediately, right? He doesn't have ground, so his lat is going to reference his pelvis. And when he starts to do this, it's like he's trying to grab through his pelvis without having that posterior stability. So he's probably front driven, which is everyone in the midline. It's just a given. I can show you 1,000 things that would suggest you're frontline driven as well myself. But as we get to be more midline supported, we lose out on that tone. And that guy had all the tone. So like when I'm looking at what I'm going to help someone with, I would apply all these things that I apply through my cert or I apply through my like education platform in that same methodology. If this is moving, his vagus nerve is unstable. No ifs, ands, or buts. And if you don't have this here,
his vagus nerve is unstable. Like a nerve being unstable, what does that actually mean?
So the anatomical structure, like the bones that are prescribing like an environment, like a relative range of motion for that. If my nerve, which I can even show a bunch of things like this, like show me your thumb if you could. Okay, so you have you work with your thumb. You can see how your thumb line pushes your radius into internal rotation. Like you're trying to push through the thumb. This is the shorter line than this line. So you're creating an action of displacing the nerve by way of, if you have that much force or kinetic load, it's going to reshape the structure such that you can make sense of it without ruining the hand. So when I teach people, particularly massage therapists or people that work with their thumbs, I teach them how to cradle something without prolapsing their thumb. Because when you prolapse your thumb, you're prolapsing your shoulder almost automatically.
Interesting. What about the vagus nerve specifically? So let's go back to the Connor Bernard thing. Because I had the still photo, and you're like, I can tell from the still photo. But then I went back to the video. I actually found the video, and like 2 seconds later, he's in extension.
Okay, I'm sure.
So
that
I mean,
through
it doesn't matter, or what?
No,
what am I missing here?
I saw the tone that I don't identify on people who have not, for the most part, done what I'm teaching. So like, the neck needs to, like, you can see my neck is bigger than both of your guys, but Anthony's jaw is more developed than mine, and actually both your jaws are more developed than mine. And it's to say that my ability to grab my rib cage is not local to my jaw. My palate's involved. There's a lot of things otherwise involved that don't restrict my ability to breathe or move my head or rotate or whatever what you say, like whatever. But when I look at these definitions of depth on the side of the head or how the eyes are moving, I see a composite where you might be hearing me say it for the first time or the third time, whatever. I'm seeing it for the 1,000th time, having looked at my own conditioning, every other athlete I've worked with, every person that have had jaw injuries to neck injuries to whatever it may be. And they're very similar behaviors that coincide. I'd almost guarantee until his neck goes up, his nostrils are probably narrow during it. I don't remember. I'm just guessing. His eyes are looking down. His chest is shot forward, so his heart is trying to move before his diaphragm has conveyed any pressure, so he's giving himself that solar plexus pressure. There are a couple of degrees of flexion that are going to need to happen to coincide with that to keep it active or keep it athletic. So that's why I'm saying he could be in an equilibrium way more performative, even though he's a professional. He has a standard of vagal tolerance or input tolerance that most people don't have. And if he can reperfuse the areas that I see that are clearly not perfused, then he can go from baby face to like man neck, man jaw, those kinds of things, where you start to see the bone density very clearly increase. You see like the body lines be more masculine or like beautiful in a masculine way. And those things are different than beautiful in a boyish way. Like you're going to see, even if someone's good looking, they're going to masculinize. There's going to be a degree of like how your face fills out. And he didn't have that.
How do you know, like, between genetics, like somebody who's genetically just like that, like if I take my dad and put it next to me, how do I know that I've got this from development versus genetics? And like, how much can you differentiate that?
If you prescribe yourself to being genetically predisposed to being weaker than human potential, that's on you, dog.
No, that's not my question. That's not my question. My question was how, how do you differentiate? Like, I'm not saying genetic potential. I'm saying you born from your father, because everybody has a genetic
That's why I'm saying your
predisposition
question
from
is
their
flawed.
parents.
Your question is
That's
flawed. You're asking me relative the mirror you've seen. So you can't qualify the behaviors of the midline for people who came from generations before us, who have way less context for what it's like to live a properly stimulated life. So maybe they're doing things that are like more business related, like they're crafting or they're building stuff. But I guarantee to you, they're not spending the time doing breath work, going out, looking up at the sky, and like making it a purposeful like meditation practice. It happens through their behavior. So if we're not creating a transaction between what we perceive should be the goal and what is the action, then the action is going to create the habit. And I can definitively tell you, however prepared my dad was to be healthy and whatever it may have been, his limitations aren't easy to see from his perspective. And I'm learning to see part in from his perspective. So in the same way, you're not seeing what your dad's not seeing. You know what I'm saying?
let's take Anthony for example. How do I know how much of his neck is from MovMed versus genetic, or working out, or what he's done through his life, or his
Um,
jaw, or his
okay.
jaw?
So
Like
genetic
if
is
just visually looking.
genetics is to suggest that he never hit his head. He never had any injuries when he was younger that could have potentially made it so that something could have gone wrong. He had every predisposition, like he got breastfed, he got walked quick enough, he got stimulated such that his eyes were moving. Like you're asking a question that's not even a standard for anyone. You have to be like a really capable person to have a capable baby. And if you are a person that gives yourself excuse for all the things that aren't standardized in your goals, then you're going to standardize relative your habits and your what you have. And that's what we all do. We look down just as much as our parents did.
Okay, so let me rephrase the question, because everyone, obviously people have trauma throughout their lives, and things happen, but you are born to a person who gives you a genetic potential. Like LeBron James is 6'9" because his parents are probably massive people. How
Okay.
much of that can you prescribe to genetics, and how do you visually see that? Like if I
So
look at Anthony right now and I say, he obviously has a nice jawline, it's big jaw, big neck. How much of that is from a parental line versus training?
I
Or
think it's alertness. I think it's trauma and shit like that. Like his nose is flared right now, but his teeth are biting. So his oris, his opiscus oris, isn't open. It's not full, but his sinus is. So there's degree of alertness he has and degree of presentation he has, but his chin is still lifted a little bit, and then there's still lacking depth through what travels behind his ear. So you're seeing a visual, but it's not like it's a qualification of his whole head's health. It's just the aesthetic that he's earned, which is why I'm saying like I was stronger than most people that I've like worked with as clients before I started doing movement. And I had a greater potential or whatever, but I think I was just gifted with privilege. Like my dad was well off enough to send me to things that gave me exposure to like I was biking, I was doing judo, I was doing jiu-jitsu, I did a bunch of different sports. I had the ability to learn in different environments. I wasn't as threatened as a lot of people are when they get home from whatever. My threats were different. They were more social than they were physical. And sometimes even if they were physical, I didn't feel like I was going to be homeless, or I didn't feel, you know what I mean? Like there's certain things that safety mechanisms help you convey, or your realization that you have more conviction than the people next to you helps you convey. So like if you're more confident as a kid than your friends are, you're probably going to develop things your friends don't, or you're going to overly gratify yourself for what you have and maybe it won't work as hard as what your friends have. I mean, me making a resting bitch face half the time was probably why I don't have as strong of his jaw as or looking of jaw as Anthony, but my jaw is stronger than his is. No offense, just been doing this longer.
okay,
How do you measure jaw strength? What's the qualification in terms of like how do you measure
Grip strength. How much
objectives?
can you bite and hold?
Right. Fair enough.
Like how much can you press together? And the only reason why I know that mine is because my palate moves more than yours does. My skull is moving from my palate. Like I don't know if you guys can visually see it, but side profile, I'm gonna take my palate, I'm gonna pull it back to my throat, and then I'm gonna try to lift the skull cap. and it's going to happen. I'm not sure if you'll see it, so you let me know if you see it. I don't know if you heard all those pops, but
Did hear the
did you
pops.
see anything lift?
It's hard to see. It's pretty blurry on my end.
Yeah, it's
Gotcha.
the
I
the
think the
live stream
recording
version
goes.
of this. Yeah, the recording has a higher quality, so we'll watch the recording back and we'll take a look at it. But
Cool.
yeah, man. The one thing that when you're talking about the movement, that is one thing that I started to feel just in the last couple of weeks in terms of the suction, where I'm starting to feel different parts of my cranium literally starting to shift around as I'm creating more suction in that vacuum. And that was like a new experience for me because it was whoa, it's just kind of like moving around the more that I'm creating this pressure. It's really interesting.
Yeah, you're going to have no problem whatsoever getting your jaw stronger, and just in habit, mine's stronger, but you have more development to have a better foundation. So you're going to get your man muscle quicker. I still have to develop a lot of this stuff that was tucked and dorky.
So what did your jaw look like before? What was
I just had a baby face. My head was just more like regressed. I wasn't quite as uh, uh, my eyes weren't as open. I had more drag here, like softness here. Like this was way more soft, and you can kind of see like the drag on the bags. That was way softer. So I'm building out the fascial tension here, and as soon as it gets to there, battery exhausted.
Yeah, I'm still here. My battery died.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
That was a weird way to see that. I didn't know if that was like everyone. I didn't know how that translated. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like the same way that you were starting to feel the benefit from suction and when you were feeling a little bit under the weather, Anthony, and how you recovered quicker with it, I think that it's a lot of the oxygen saturation, nitrogen production, and CO2 tolerance that comes with being in that state. So depending on how much you can condition there being a nitric threshold, the heat, and then you having a robust fullness, that's everything. I would say that's a priority over the bolt score, oxygen hunger. I even have a different quality or qualification for oxygen hunger. I think the yawn is a hungry feeling, and it's like wanting for more oxygen saturation. And when I get people to start breathing the yawn into their nose breaths, it starts to get the saliva and everything working. I think that's. I'm gonna just articulate air hunger in a different thing.
There you go. So we're coming up on 102 minutes here, and I just noticed the time. I have another call in 5 minutes, so I got to wrap. But this was a cool conversation. We got into all kinds of weeds here, and I mean, there's a lot to unpack that we're gonna have to go back and unpack. So, guys, if you want to check out Nate's work, which I highly recommend you do, go to movmed.net. That's MOVMED.net. You can also find him on Instagram at _MOVMED_. Is it 2 underscores or 1 underscore per side?
2 underscores, but you'll
2
see
underscores per side, so double underscore. And as always, let us know what you thought of this episode. Let us know if you want us to clarify certain points, if you disagreed with certain things. We always love hearing the feedback because we're just trying to expand the conversation. The Art of Move is more than anything. It's a community discussion about these ideas, and we want to keep that community discussion alive. So let's keep going. Give us some feedback. Leave us a comment in the YouTube video. Send us a DM. I'm at anthony.manuel, Manuele, and you can find Will at The Art of Move. Nate, thanks for hopping on. Thanks for having another conversation. This was super, super fun.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Nate. I may have been asking you some tough questions, and it gets heated at times. We both love it, and I appreciate your work. I appreciate your passion, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, brother. I didn't take it at all to offense. I appreciate you asking questions that are thoughtful instead of where most people misdirect or redirect. This is not how I learned it.
Instagram is not the best place to debate. So
that's
anytime you want to come on and have a discussion, debate, let's do it.
Bitchin'. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah.
Right, we'll catch you on the next episode of The Art of Move, guys.
Have a good one.
Guys. Take care.